This is question number 1 on homework 3. So this is a very standard question on calculating the expected return and standard deviations. My focus here is on standard deviations because most of the problems come from this part of the calculation. Consider the following information. So we're provided with this table with different economy of states and the probability for each state and its corresponding return. And we have two stocks, stock A and stock B. So the first part is on the calculation of the expected rate of return. But as I said, I will focus on the second part on the standard deviation calculations. So for online class, the most convenient way to do this calculations is for me is to use Excel. So I'm going to open a spreadsheet and simply copy the information. State of economy. So we have 3 states and we have probability and we have 2 stocks, stock A and stock B. So we just recession. First state is recession. Under recession, the probability is 0.817. So that simply means the recession happens with 17% probability. And under recession, the return for stock A is 0.08, so that's 8%. And return for stock B is a negative number, negative 12%. And the second economy state is normal. So under normal state, it's this happens with a 58% chance, and under the normal state, stock A return for stock A is 11%, and return for stock B is 17%. And finally, the third state is the booming state. Under booming state, the probability for this state to happen is 25%, and under the booming state, stock A gave us a return of 16%, and stock B is 34%. So first, expect return R A is remember the expect return is simply the weighted average of returns, and the weight here is the probability for under each economy state. So for stock A, the probability under recession is 0.17. So we simply multiply this probability. So let me use equal sign equals the probability under recession times the return under recession for stock A, and then go on plus the probability for the normal state times the return under normal state, and plus the probability for the booming state times the return under the booming state. And so that's simply our expected return for stock A. And stock B is similarly, the calculation is done similarly. So that equals the probability for recession, 17%, times the return for stock B under recession is negative 12%, and then plus the probability for normal state times the return under normal state for stock B, and then plus the probability for booming state times the return under the booming state. So that's our expected rate of return for stock B. So this part of the calculation is very straightforward, and most students can get these calculations correct. most of the problems, as I said, comes from the calculation of the standard deviations. So let me just focus on this part. Sigma, we use the sigma, generally we use the sigma to denote standard deviation. So sigma A equals, so expected rate of return is the weighted average of all returns, and weight is the probability for under each economy state. And the standard deviation, actually the definition is similar. It's also a weighted average, but the weight here is also the probability under each economy state. But we will need to multiply the probability by different numbers. Here it's the weighted average of the what we call the squared deviation of each return from the expected rate of return. So what this means is that the deviation, first to do the deviation, calculate the deviation. That's simply the difference between the return under each economy state and the expected rate of return. And then after we do the deviation calculation, we take the square of that. So that's a squared deviation. And then we multiply that squared deviation by the corresponding probability. And then we sum up all these products, the product of the probability and the squared deviations. And then we take the square root of that, the total sum. And so that's simply the square root of the weighted average of the squared deviation from each economy from the expected rate of return, and the weight is the probability. So with that definition of the standard deviation, we can just do the calculation. So it's a square root. So the square root function in Excel is SQRT, so equals SQRT, and we have a very large parentheses because everything needs to be inside this square root function. So then we take the probability. Remember, we take the probability under recession, and then times, and then we need to multiply by the squared deviation. So we first do the deviation calculation. So the deviation for stock A under recession, the return under recession minus the expected rate of return for stock A, and then close that parentheses and take the square of that. So that's what we call the probability times squared deviation. So it's the return under each state minus the expected rate of return, and then take the square root of that. So we go on this. So that's under the recession. Then under the normal state, this happens with the 58% chance, and then times the squared deviation. So we take the deviation first, the return under normal state minus the expected rate of return for stock A, and then take the square root of that, take the square of that, and then plus go on under the booming state. This happens with 25% chance times the deviation return for stock A under booming state minus the expected rate of return for stock A, and then take the square of that. So I think just you probably want to double check expression, because sometimes you may miss a parenthesis sign or some other symbols. So just want to make sure it's correct. So it looks like it is. So it's the standard deviation of stock A is this basically 2.69%. So we need to go back to the problem and be mindful of the rounding requirement. So for the standard deviation, it's do not round intermediate calculations. Enter your answers as a percent rounded to 2 decimal places. So this will be, you just keep, I think expected rate of return, the rounding requirement is similar. So we just basically keep 2 decimal places and put those into percentage terms. So that will become this. Yeah, or these are in percentage terms. So then finally, sigma for stock B is done very similarly. Actually, if you prefer, you can just copy this. But remember, you need to revise. This will be, so maybe just for the illustration purpose, maybe just redo this calculation. This can give you a better idea about how this is done. So it's remember, it's square root. It's a big parenthesis because everything needs to be inside that square root. And then it's the probability under recession times the deviation for under recession for stock B minus the expected rate of return for stock B. So that's the deviation. And then they take the square of that and go on under the normal state probability times the deviation minus expected the return for stock B under normal state minus the expected rate of return for stock B, and take the square of that and go on under the booming state. This happens with this probability times the deviation of from the expected rate of return, and then square of that. So this is the standard deviation of stock B. So now let me put into the answers 11.74% expected return for stock A, and expected return for stock B 16.32%. And the sigma standard deviation for stock A is 2.69%, and the sigma standard deviation for stock B is 14.65%. Okay, so now let me check my work. All right, so it looks like we have done it right. So I hope that by this example, you have learned how to do the calculation of the expected return and especially the standard deviations using Excel, because that's the most convenient way to do this type of calculations, at least for me.